and welcome to this video introducing Reconstruction. This is part of my series that looks at the causes of the American Civil War, the course of the Civil War itself, and then Reconstruction that follows. So today we're going to look at this really contentious bit of American history that is really significant. But we're just setting the scene. We're looking at the key elements, the key groups and people that are going to be involved in the early stages of Reconstruction, and we're setting the scene in 1865 in terms of what's been going on. So the situation in 65, well, the Confederacy had been defeated, slavery had ended, and we've got the 13th Amendment going through. So the idea of Reconstruction, Lincoln had believed, was within the power of the presidents, and he'd faced some opposition to that through Congress. And his 10% plan, which I looked at in my previous video on Lincoln, had been opposed in Congress, and they proposed the Wade Davis bill instead, which he had vetoed. There wasn't really no agreement at this stage on what the position of the freed people was going to be, how much the federal government was going to support them. The Freedmen's Bureau had been created, but exactly the extent of its powers and how long it was going to last and exactly what it was going to do were not 100% clear. Now, one of the other big questions is what's going to happen with the black population? First of all, is it going to be compensated for these hundreds of years of slavery which it has suffered at the hands of the Americans? So there's an awful lot to look at. Now, the circumstances under which the states would re-enter the Union hasn't been sorted, and whether they actually technically left was still disputed. And there's a real oddity in this, in that whilst the Union had insisted all the way through that the states were just in rebellion, that the Confederacy was not a legitimate separate country, the Confederacy had always argued that they had left, that they had formed their own country. And almost in Reconstruction, we get the arguments reversed. Whilst the Union states are trying to control the pace and the circumstances into which the Confederate states can rejoin the Union, whilst the Confederate states are going, but you guys said we never left, so we don't have to rejoin. We are already part. So that led to some difficult arguments. Of course, the big event of 65, and other than the ending of the war, was the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Now, his vice president, the Southerner Andrew Johnson, would take his place. How he would act was going to be really unclear, and we'll look at a bit later in the video at Johnson. And then we've got the issue of accountability and blame. So there has been all this death, all this destruction, this horrendous war. Were people going to be held accountable for it? Was the blame going to be laid squarely at the door of the Confederates' leadership? How far down was it going to go? Were anybody who fought going to be held responsible for their actions? Now, Lincoln had suggested a line of leniency, and he talks about malice to none at the end of the end of the war. So it isn't 100% clear exactly what's going to happen, because Johnson had described them all as traitors. Now, the impact of the war itself is an issue of debate. Now, there is, well, what is a predominantly Southern narrative about this, which talks about how the South suffered and the North prospered during the war. Now, the idea of one side prospering during a civil war is clearly an oversimplification and just not true. Now, the total number of deaths from the Civil War, the numbers on this are quite contentious and vary quite enormously, but we're talking somewhere between 620 and 850,000 deaths on relatively recent calculations. So both the North and the South have suffered here. Both have got wounded veterans, both those have got war widows and war orphans to care for. Now, the war had brought an end to slavery, ending the suffering this had brought to the black population in the South. So this idea of portraying the war having a fully negative impact on the South is purely actually, if you look at it from a white Southern point of view, rather than looking at it from the point of view of the black population in the South, the vast majority of whom were held as slaves. Now, the North and the federal government were left not only with their own war debts, but obviously the Confederacy had collapsed and their government wasn't there anymore, and therefore it wasn't going to be able to pay the bill for rebuilding the South. That bill would fall upon the federal government, and because of that, mostly on the southern states. So there is some elements where we can see that the South has suffered more. I mean, clearly more of the fighting was done in the South. There was a huge amount of damage done to the South, most notably by Sherman and his men, and we've got an image at the top of the screen of Sherman's men tearing up railroad tracks. The South's economy is badly damaged because previous to the war they dominated cotton production, but due to the fact that southern cotton wasn't widely available, or as widely available during the Civil War, places like Britain had looked to alternative markets, notably India. Modern industry had been bolstered to an extent by war demand, but that was building war product. And bear in mind, when it comes to things like the cotton trade, it was northern factories that turned the cotton into cloth. It was the northern shipyards that took the cotton over to Europe. It was the northern banks that bankrolled the plantation owners. So the damage isn't completely one way. There had been the Homesteaders Act in '62, and obviously this had been an act that had aimed to help population in the north and not the southern population. So there is an area of debate, but the portrayal of the idea that it is just the South that suffer, I don't think is true. Now, the new president then in '65 is Andrew Johnson. He was a self-made man. He'd raised up from being a tailor's apprentice to being a rich landowner, and then eventually becomes president. Really interesting, he was the only Confederate senator to remain loyal to the Union during the entirety of the war. He had been a Democrat. He had been a slave owner. So quite an unusual choice, you would have thought, for Lincoln going in to the '64 election, and definitely not what you'd expect to, or not who you'd expect to have in charge of the United States following the Union victory. The radical Republicans actually believed Johnson was going to be really harsh on the Confederates, harder than Lincoln had been. He had consistently referred to rebel leaders as traitors. So on that, there was an idea in the radical Republicans that he could take a really hard line, and a harder line than Lincoln had been. But there's a very big but on this. But the main one is Johnson's racial politics. He was not a believer in equality and was determined to prevent the black population gaining the vote. He wanted to continue Reconstruction as an executive issue rather than a legislative one, so he wanted to keep control of it. He wanted to return all southern states to the Union by the end of '65, so he wanted to do this in a real mad rush. And he wanted to get the United States back to functioning as it had been before as soon as possible. And if this involved working with ex-Confederates, he favoured leniency. And he believed that the suffrage and social and economic policy in the southern states was not the responsibility of the federal government, but the responsibility of those state governments. And you can imagine the nature of what those state governments are likely to be if you prevent black suffrage. Johnson is a real problem, and we're going to see in the story of Reconstruction the first couple of years is a massive clash between him and Congress. And the main group he clashes with are these guys here, the radical Republicans. So they wanted to take control of Reconstruction, which they shouted the Wade Davis bill. They wanted harsh punishment on the South. They wanted further amendments, notably the 14th Amendment. And they were trying to push for greater assurance over black rights and in particular for the black vote. They set up the Freedmen's Bureau, and that had been established in '65, and it provided the basics really: food, housing, medical aid. It established schools, offered legal assistance. It did also try to settle former slaves on confiscated Confederate land. Now, the issue over land is going to become a really contentious one, and this is an area where the black population is really going to miss out. And often they were given land, confiscated land at the beginning of Reconstruction, and then later have it taken off them when the rights of the former owners of that land are recognised. The leading light in the radical Republicans was Thaddeus Stevens, and he did believe in redistribution of land. He wanted to make sure the federal government's ascendancy over states' government was properly established, and that the rights of the freedmen were ensured. And he wanted these governments to use military rule if needed to do so. Now, as you can see, the radical Republicans, the likes of Thaddeus Stevens, whose picture's on the screen, and Charles Sumner and others, their views are so contrasting to Johnson's, then it's clear to see why there's such a major clash over the following couple of years. Right, some other major groups and who are going to be involved in all of this. Well, first of all, the white Southerners. So they wanted to rebuild the South, but they wanted to rebuild it as close to how it had been before the war as they could possibly get away with. They introduced black codes, which are very similar to the old slave codes, and these were designed to maintain the position of the freed population as second-class citizen under the control of the white population. They wanted, the former slave owners wanted compensation. They said that they had lost $4 billion worth of property. Again, that really unpleasant use of language that they were using. And so they thought, rather than the black population being compensated and giving land, that they should be compensated for having lost their slaves. The former Confederate leaders believed that they should be able to maintain their positions of power, and if they'd been elected before the war, then they should maintain those positions as they returned. And they argued that those positions were still valid because the Union argued that the Confederacy had never left, and therefore they should be able to simply return to Congress and everything else as if nothing had happened. Northerners were still considered to be an invading force by many white Southerners, and Northern ways of doing things were still rejected. So we got this clash of cultures in the Civil War, where the South thought their way of doing things was better than the Northern way of doing things, and they hadn't changed their mind just because they lost the war. The other major group in this is going to be the former slaves. Now, obviously, the initial part of this is this huge joy at gaining freedom. And then we've got the practicalities of the next step. They wanted land, they wanted education, they wanted the ability to live independently of the white population, which is very understandable given the horrors of the previous couple of hundred years. And they especially wanted to get away from their former owners in the most part. They wanted equal treatment under law, they wanted equal treatment in society, they wanted the vote. And there's very little, if any, evidence that actually the black population sought revenge and was going to go out and start attacking the white population. The white population was particularly paranoid. One of the areas of the black codes was preventing the former slaves from owning weapons, and black men who had fought for the Union Army and returned home to the South faced particularly hostile reception from the local white population. Now, there's a law in here where you can look at, and you look at, well, actually, you can say, if you look at the Black Lives Matter movement at the moment, you can say, well, there's a really strong argument that even now, the black population aren't receiving equal treatment under law and equal treatment in society. So that would all suggest all this stuff in Reconstruction fails horribly, but that isn't actually completely the case. Now, what happens is Reconstruction ultimately fails, but there are actual moves forward during Reconstruction, particularly in issues like the vote. However, we will see enormous resistance to this from the white population and groups like the KKK, and ultimately the final group, though I've not done another slide on them, is the population of the North, which will start off with supporting Reconstruction, eventually kind of loses interest or the will to push it further. So that's an introduction to Reconstruction. I will then be going into, in the next videos, I'll be going into Congress versus Johnson and what happens there, and we'll be looking at things like the 14th and 15th Amendment. And then we'll look at the period of more radical Reconstruction once Ulysses S. Grant becomes president, and then as it all starts to collapse and go horribly wrong, as we see the white Southern population trying to regain control and we see groups who are referred to as redeemers, and this includes groups like the KKK, who look to re-establish white dominance. And with that, we ultimately end with a real terrible compromise in 1877, which sees essentially the federal government and the North abandon the former slave population to white rule in the South. Right, so hopefully that's been a helpful introduction for you, and looked at the position in 65 at the start of Reconstruction. Please like, subscribe, and keep coming back. There's more on Reconstruction to come. I'll speak to you all soon. Thank you very much.